Welcome to the webinar today. I am Matt Cederberg, Chief Strategy Officer at Coreform, and we're joined with today's webinar presenter, Patrick Shriwise from Argonne National Labs. This webinar is featuring the advances in the Coreform Cubit DAGMC workflow. And this is something we've been investing in quite a bit over the last few months, and we're excited to share with you. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, the webinar is being recorded. You can ask questions in the Q&A box. We've got some Cubit experts and Patrick as well. We can answer those throughout the webinar. And we also will be sending out the slides later for your consumption. So with that, let me turn the time over to Patrick.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you for asking me to come and host this webinar today. So yeah, as Matt mentioned, I work at Argonne National Laboratory on primarily Monte Carlo particle transport and neutronics on OpenMC, but also in my time at UW-Madison during my PhD work quite a bit on DAGMC, and become really interested in this new space with integration of DAGMC within the Coreform Cubit software. So today we'll just be going through a few different items on our agenda, talking about DAGMC workflows within Coreform Cubit and how that's evolved recently, what DAGMC does to enable CAD-based geometry in Monte Carlo simulation, and how to maximize the value. Kind of the main topic today is maximizing the value of existing MCMP models in Coreform Cubit. So there's a number of different motivations for this. You potentially have an MCMP input deck that's in a text-based format that you would like to visualize in 3D interactively. And that in and of itself has a lot of value. So the ability to import these in Cubit enables that for you. You potentially have a model that you would like to start doing multiphysics or incorporating other physics separate from neutronics on an identical model to the one that you're using with MCMP. And then also we use this quite a bit for benchmarking DAGMC. And that's kind of what our mini exercise later in the webinar. We'll talk about, as a result of this exercise, we're going to be talking about preparing these CAD models once we've imported them for DAGMC simulations in Coreform Cubit. If you're kind of interested in how to manually assign metadata, I would recommend looking at the previous webinar that's linked here in the slides, and these slides will be provided separately after the webinar is over. But today we're going to be working with the metadata, kind of translating the metadata that's imported with the MCMP model that we'll be working with, or the MCMP model that we're choosing for importing into Cubit. So a little bit, just taking a step back, talking about some of the trends in neutronics analysis and why this space has been evolving recently. There's certain motivations for using CAD and neutronics-based workflows. One is simply to streamline a larger engineering workflow, where even if you're using neutronics only, perhaps you have a CAD model coming from other engineering spaces. And rather than duplicating that model or spending a lot of human time and capital on duplicating that model for a native geometry format like constructive solid geometry, which is what almost every Monte Carlo code supports, you can simply use that CAD model and start adding neutronics to your engineering workflow in an integrated fashion, really streamlined fashion. Kind of another direction you might come at this from is you have a neutronics tool chain in place, and you would now start to employ multiphysics potentially if you want to be looking at that for TH design. This is something we feel like has been encountered quite a bit in the fission space in terms of advanced reactor designs, where previous benchmarks are no longer really applicable to some of these new designs. And so we need to employ higher fidelity simulation and multiphysics to understand the nature of the interaction between the neutronics and the TH or thermal hydraulics within the core. In the fusion ecosystem, there's a lot of startup companies that would like to get up and running as quickly as possible. Having to duplicate a neutronics model in CSG, especially given the nature of the geometric complexity, like we see here on the right for a tokamak model or for a stellarator model, it's really valuable to be able to just go ahead and start running neutronics on your CAD model directly. There's also a certain level of motivation with regards to advanced manufacturing. There's a project at Oak Ridge, for example, called the Transformational Challenge Reactor. And that one employs 3D printing of metals and things along those lines. And those inherently incorporate CAD into their design workflows. And so again, streamlining Neutronics in that space is of high value as well. So as far as how we go about this, there's a toolkit that we'll be talking about today as the Direct Accelerated Monte Carlo Toolkit, or DAGMC. This is a toolkit that's designed to enable a CAD-based surface mesh representation for geometry in Monte Carlo Neutronics. This project began at UW-Madison around 2009, and it accomplishes this geometry representation for these particle-based codes by employing triangle surface tessellations of the CAD-based geometry or the CAD geometry itself, but it maintains an embedded topology, which I think is a critical or distinguishing aspect of DAGMC compared to other approaches in this space, in that it allows for an extra level of efficiency when particles are moving from surface or from volume to volume or cell to cell within the model, as well as some robustness in the particle track. So essentially the relationships between surfaces and volumes and what volume is on what side of a surface, et cetera, is maintained within this mesh-based model when we get to this intermediate step here shown in the middle. And then finally, that model can be applied in simulation within our code. So kind of tying this to the set of tools that we use to do this sort of analysis, again, we might be approaching CAD-based modeling in Neutronics from one side, where we already have a model that's in a native geometry format from any of the codes that DAGMC supports, like the subset here that I'm showing is OpenMC, GANT4, or MCMP, or perhaps we've been doing multiphysics with the CAD model, and now we want to enable Neutronics in that multiphysics simulation as well. So you may have been using something like Moose or Precise or MFEM, any of those tools, but the commonality or the kind of center point of the ability to enable CAD-based Monte Carlo Neutronics using DAGMC is through Coreform and DAGMC in this space. There are a number of different open source approaches to generating DAGMC models as well, I should note. But these are, I would say, a little bit still up and coming in this space, and it's yet to be determined whether or not they're going to be able to handle some of the geometries and complex topologies that Coreform or Cubit itself has already been able to, has proven that it can handle to this point in time. So there's multiple different ways to generate these DAGMC models is kind of the end point here, but today we'll be talking about the integrated capabilities with the Cubit specific. So Cubit is a meshing software that's been around for some time now. It has the ability to import existing CAD models and perform certain cleanup operations in there in a somewhat automated fashion, along with some automated or semi-automated meshing capabilities as well. We have within that a GUI that provides us, an interactive visualization of this mesh, along with control of these different mesh elements and the meshing algorithms, and then diagnostics to kind of report on the mesh quality of the resulting mesh as well. Some of the more powerful capabilities within Cubit is an ability to interact like inside of the GUI, or really just outside of the GUI within a Python module that it has all the capabilities of the internal Cubit software via Python. And we'll be leveraging that heavily today as we go through the process of importing an MCMP model and prepping it for DAGMC transport. So it's really powerful capability, and we'll be just exercising that a little bit. Also recently, as we mentioned, we have the integrated DAGMC workflow, and I'll go into a little more detail on what's been going on in that space. So in recent months, Coreform has incorporated the DAGMC export capability into the software itself. So this is now distributed with Coreform Cubit, I think since version 2023.8. But any version going forward that you'll acquire is going to have this integrated capability. And so with that kind of comes these a couple of newly developed dedicated surface meshing parameters that apply globally to the tri-meshing that's available in Cubit. And that allows us just to easily adjust the overall fidelity of the surfaces, the triangulated surfaces, with respect to the original CAD model. Some of the benefits of this are kind of inherent within this integrated meshing and export capability. So first off, I would say that like the meshes that are generated when we mesh this within Cubit are inherently watertight upon their generation. There previously was, or is, I guess, in the sort of ad hoc DAGMC plugin that's still available within Cubit. You can still use that and export it, but it uses the graphics facets. And so the internal mesh representation is much more opaque, first off. So we can't see what that mesh looks like necessarily. It just kind of happens in the back end. And there's also an additional sealing step that's required because when those facets for visualization are generated, they're not really incorporating the topology, and as a result, can't be guaranteed to be watertight. So there is a robust sealing algorithm available, but it's an extra step. Whereas with this integrated approach, the mesh that's generated and that we see on the screen is inherently watertight to begin with. And so that's a big benefit. And we'll talk about a couple other benefits related to mesh refinement as well as we go forward. The export capability, once all the meshing and metadata setup has been done, is integrated within Cubit. So simply the ability to go to a file and click on export and things like that is in place, and options related to that are still under development. So this is kind of a new wide open space that we're starting to explore with both DAGMC exporting, but also this integrated ability to import MCMP models, which similarly has been included in the GUI itself. So this will be something that we exercise today going forward. And then parallel to that, within the DAGMC ecosystem itself, which is an independent software toolchain from Cubit, we have updated some of the DAGMC documentation, and that's been supported by Coreform. So I'll just click on that so we can see a little bit of a more modern approach to the documentation compared to what's been there in the past, as well as an extended set of information on the file specification in support of these other open source approaches to developing DAGMC models. This file specification is now published in detail so that it can be well understood how these files can be generated and what they contain, as well as the C++ API and some other more detailed information about the theory behind tracking particles in DAGMC and how to design particle tracking algorithms to integrate with your code. So just a much more rich, I think, environment for documentation is being developed and will continue development going forward. Additionally, in the DAGMC community, we've recognized a need for some updates to the software itself at kind of a very deep level. So a DAGMC reboot is currently underway. We're working on a library that is going to support multiple mesh libraries. So we currently rely on a format that uses MOAB, the mesh-oriented database from Argonne National Laboratory. But we're also going to be including support for file specifications from libmesh as well as MFIM going forward, and including things like support for volumetric mesh particle tracking and supporting tally operations on volumetric mesh as well. And then going forward, it's a relatively easy step to go from triangles just to doing quads and hexes. And so we'd like to enable that as well to broaden the kinds of meshes that we can support with DAGs too. Okay, so at this point, kind of now that we've gone over the higher level notes on what's going on in this space, we'll start pivoting into an exercise with DAGMC. And so I just want to revisit at a high level, like what are the two primary motivators for using DAGMC that we've seen in this space. And so one is you have a CAD model that's built in CAD, whether it was built in Cubit or SolidWorks or CATIA, what have you. It can be imported or loaded into the file. This is pretty common for things like the Stellarator model. Is not something that you would want to attempt to design in CSG. And so these almost always come in from a CAD model or some other system that creates these surfaces in some kind of boundary representation format. So once that's in, then you can add the metadata that's required to describe material assignments and boundary conditions, and temperature information, things like that, for the Neutronics code and then export your DAGMC model. So that's one variation. And again, that's something that we've covered to some degree in a previous seminar that's been linked in the slides here. The other approach is you have a CSG model from a Monte Carlo code. The one that we're showing in the background here is just a snippet of some input from an MCMP input deck. And you want to either visualize this or enable some other analysis on this, or perhaps get the CAD model so that you can then take that and extend it and add on to it, or what have you. And so this text-based input format can be translated into something that's much more human, intuitive, and explorable in CAD in a pretty automated fashion with this capability. So for this demonstration, I've pulled a model from the Criticality Safety Benchmark Suite, the ICSB EP handbook that's provided by the OECD NEA. And this in particular, this model is a simplified model of the zero power physics reactor that was built at the Argonne West facility, which is really Idaho National Laboratory, on their site in around 1970. And experiments were on this for a couple of decades related to space power applications and fast reactor breeder applications and things like that. So this particular configuration of the subcritical assembly that we're looking at here contains this whole slew of different materials, and it was designed, this particular configuration was designed to explore what would happen if the space reactor was embedded in Earth in an accident scenario. So it contains all of these different things, and then around the outside of it is essentially what was a whole bunch of sand placed to see what Neutronics effect that would have on the interior core. So what we'll be doing today with this model is walking through a model import within Cubit. We'll be doing some metadata prep primarily with scripting. So we're going to be leveraging that capability within Cubit to do something once, a generalized operation, and describe that in a Python script, and then be able to reproduce that going forward. We'll talk a little bit about meshing this model for DAGMC, and then we'll export that model. And for simplicity today, we'll go ahead and run this model with OpenMC as opposed to MCMP. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that when we get to that point using a DAGMC universe, and a little bit about the mixed geometry format that's available in OpenMC for combining CSG geometry with CAD-based geometry using these DAGMC. So but I'll touch a little bit more on that in more detail as we get there. So at this point, I'll go ahead and switch over to Cubit, and then really quick, actually, my terminal. I'll the text a little bit. So in here, I have this criticality benchmark. I'm just going to show a little bit of like what these text-based files look like. Here we are. It's kind of not exactly what I would call like a human interpretable thing. CSG is really nice because you can, it's very robust, and you can
Hey,
modify.
Patrick,
Yes.
we can only see the browsers window still.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let me change my sharing settings. Thanks, man. Give that another go. Is that any better?
That's perfect. Yep.
Great. So again, this is this sort of text-based format of the MCMP inputs, and they are not necessarily human interpretable. For example, this line tells you that this is a cell definition and that it occupies spaces on the certain sides of these different surfaces with material and a density. But that's not something that you would naturally read and understand if you were not familiar with these input syntaxes. So let's move this into something that's a little bit easier to understand. Is my Coreform Cubit window showing up, Matt?
Yep.
All right, great. Just wanted to double check. So I'm in a fresh startup of Cubit here, and we'll go ahead and go to File and Import option. And within this dropdown now, in recent versions of Coreform Cubit, you'll see this MCP option. So I can navigate to this folder where I have my webinar information and my folder containing this benchmark model. I did have to rename this file with a .i suffix at the end because that's a common suffix for MCP inputs. Just to note that, like, if you aren't seeing your MCP input model show up, that may be a reason why. So I just tacked that onto the end of this file name so that it would be recognized. And if I go ahead and open this and click on finish, this is a place where we may be adding some import options in the future. But for now, we just are going to use all the default settings of this underlying tool for importing MCP models. And so it's going to go through this whole process, and it's going to interpret all of these different Boolean combinations of the CSG primitives like cylinders, spheres, planes, etc., to produce this CAD model that we see here of the zero power physics reactor. Additionally, what we'll notice in the model tree, if we expand this, is that a whole bunch of information has been imported from this model, and it comes in and is added to the group names of the Coreform or the Cubit model here. And this is traditionally and historically how we would specify metadata within DAGMC. So there's a couple of steps that we need to take here to apply this to the simulation that we're going to run today. And the first thing that we'll do is actually just remove some unnecessary information for running with OpenMC if you're using a DAGMC geometry. So the first is that there's this graveyard volume that surrounds this entire model. This is something historical that we've used in DAGMC to indicate, or that's really used in MCMP to indicate a boundary of a problem here. So this encompasses the entire space, but within that volume, if I go ahead and right-click that and turn off the visibility of that, as well as this intermediate volume, we see that this is truly the physical boundary of our problem. And we just say that any particles that get outside of this are immediately terminated within the simulation. So I'm actually going to turn those back on. So if I look at this body, there we go, all visible. So we're going to go ahead and simply remove these because we don't need them. There's really no purpose for them in an OpenMC transport situation. So we'll go ahead and remove that graveyard volume. And then there's this exterior volume as well, surrounding kind of the large cylinder inside that is supposed to represent the boundary of the reactor room. So we can remove that. So now what we're left with here is really just all of the space within the CAD model that is relevant to our calculation. Additionally, I wanted to note that there are two critical operations for DAGMC in robust transport. So one of those is imprinting all of the surfaces with respect to one another in a given CAD model. So if this was built or imported from another space, I would definitely want to run my imprint body all option within Cubit, and that happens automatically as part of this import. So when I do this, I can go ahead and run that. It's not really harmful in any way to rerun that operation. It will, give me this information, but that's already been done, and I can kind of bear that out to myself by saying merge body all. So this is the merge process that after the imprinting, it will take those surfaces that have been identified as being kind of coincident between two different parts and then merge them together into a single entity. And so when I run this, I've already imprinted this model, and we can see that it contains on the interior coincident parts. We see that no surfaces or curves, vertices have been merged. And while that would be concerning in a model that hasn't been imprinted and merged already, in this case, that happened on import. So we don't need to worry about it here. But I always want to note those because those are really critical operations for producing a robust DAGMC. Okay, So just a little bit about this model. I think I mentioned already that it has many coincident surfaces within it. It contains kind of this large outer shell around the core section that's in the middle here, where we contain all of these different kinds of materials that we see. And so some of these larger sections above and below are beryllium oxide reflectors. There's also some large sand volumes in here for this particular configuration, if I remember. And then just kind of a fun anecdote, they actually couldn't get enough sand to surround this entire reactor, so they ended up filling it with sodium carbonate. I don't actually know why sodium carbonate in particular, but that was what they decided. I thought that was kind of interesting. So I can kind of just move through all these, and we see that we have some materials near the bottom here that are some of our core elements, and they all contain these different, so these different groups within the model tree contain our different materials that's come in from this MC. Okay, so I'll go ahead and turn off my section view of this again. We'll zoom out a little so you can see the whole core. Now, the way that this metadata comes in is in a legacy format for DAGMC assignments. And so the first step that we're going to do is we're going to update the names of these using a Python script. And so this is going to be kind of an example of like, a generalized operation for taking this legacy DAGMC naming scheme and updating it to one that DAGMC would recognize if we were to use the ad hoc or UW-based DAGMC plugin that you can enable within Cubit, but is not the integrated version. And so what that format would look like is something more like this, where we have a property here being a material assignment, and then the identifier for that material, and then a / that separates that from the next property, which in this case would be a density value for that particular volume. So I'm not actually going to update that. I'm just wanted to give an example of kind of what we're going for with this Python script. And I could click each of these different materials and update the names manually to get to that point. But here, we're instead going to go up to this play button in the toolbar. And I'm just going to click on that and navigate to my folder where I have a few different Cubit scripts. And select, instead of a journal file, I'm actually going to use a Python to do this. So I have 3 scripts here that we're going to be using today. And the first one is going to be new DAGMC. So this is just going to take all the groups in an old model and update those names into the new DAGMC form. And I'll note that each of these different scripts that we're using today will provide on the forum later on, and there'll also be links in the slides at the end of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and open this file, and by opening it, it's going to go ahead and execute that script. And pretty much instantaneously, we can see that all of the names for these different groups have been updated for this new format that would be usable by DAGMC. And so at this point, we could use the old DAGMC workflow and exporter to leverage these group names, but in the Coreform integrated DAGMC space, we're trying to use constructs that are more relevant or more purpose for these kinds of material assignment operations. And so, as we talked about a lot in the previous webinar, we are really trying to move to things where we're using mesh-based constructs within the GUI, within the Coreform model, so that we don't have to worry about things like exporting and importing and losing this metadata. It should just be inherent in the model itself when we're trying to describe it. So things like doing material assignments using mesh blocks and boundary conditions using side sets, things that are a little bit more translatable or understandable for those coming from an FEA space. And that includes material definitions as well. So similar to our group renaming, we could go through and make sure that we create a new mesh block and add the relevant volumes to it for each of these material assignments. Here we see one that's somewhat deep in the core. Oops. For this first material assignment, material 10. And I could create a mesh block for this, add the volume, and then create a new material here as well, and assign that to the block. But what much more preferable would simply be to leverage another Python script to do this. And so that's exactly what we're going to do today. So here, I'm going to go ahead and hit play, my play button again. And within this scripts file, I'm going to go to the Python files and say here, I'm going to use this script that says translate my groups or my group assignments to these blocks and materials in the format. So I'll go ahead and run that. And it's going to go through here and it's going to generate a whole bunch of different blocks that are analogous to these material assignments that were done by groups, and a whole set of materials that, again, are analogous to the materials that are identified here for those groups. So within the current model, we don't have a lot of description of what these material compositions are, and so those do need to reference something still within the Monte Carlo code itself. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. That's something that we would like to approach in the future, is the ability to describe material compositions here within Cubit as well. But for now, we're just going to kind of match them based on their identifiers within the Monte Carlo. Okay. So now that we have our material assignments taken care of, the last thing we need to do for metadata is go ahead and set boundary conditions. So unlike MCMP, OpenMC relies on surface boundary conditions to define the exterior space, or the kind of endpoint of the physical model. And so we're going to be using that capability today. Just zoom stuff around a little bit if possible. Okay. So I will switch to selecting some surfaces, and really here, this boundary of the large cylinder surrounding our core is meant to represent the exterior of the reactor room or experimental space. And so what we can do here is go ahead and create a new side set. So I'll do this all through the command panel, right? Let's see, it's node set. So I want to create a side set. The idea is not particularly relevant here. And again, while we're trying to improve and use some of the constructs that are available, that are more purposed for mesh operations, we are going to need to use a pretty specific name here for this boundary condition, so that it's recognized by OpenMC as a vacuum boundary condition. And then I am going to select the surfaces that I would like to include in this. That's going to be the top, bottom, and barrel of this cylinder. And then I can just go ahead and select apply. And then here I can see that side set appear in my model tree. And so at this point, that will indicate to OpenMC that any particles that cross that surface should be terminated and they've exited the problem. And that's really all there is to it for translating the metadata from an MCMP file directly into this new format for the integrated export capability. And so with that, we can go ahead and start talking about meshing. So we'll switch over to our meshing mode. And if I click on surfaces, because we just need to mesh surfaces for the DAGMC model, I can select my meshing scheme and go to the try mesher. All of the surfaces in a DAGMC model need to be meshed for it to operate properly. So we'll go ahead and select all of the surfaces just by typing all in the box here. And then we can use the new coarse mesh settings within the try mesher that has been added for the purpose of DAGMC models, or is motivated anyways by DAGMC exports, and use the two parameters here. So one is the anisotropic ratio. So this governs how quickly the sizes of triangles can change across the surface. So if you have really fine parts or things like that, it will try to have the triangles not change too quickly. A ratio of 100 is actually fairly large, so this would accommodate a lot of components with small features and allow the triangles to change relatively quickly. But if for whatever reason you have a particular part where you don't want the triangles to change, this can be adjusted. I think probably the more influential one is the deviation angle, meaning how much the triangle is allowed to deviate an angle from the analytic surface, going triangle to triangle as that mesh is generated. And so meshing this model is as simple as applying this scheme with the deviation angle set. We'll select 1 here, and then selecting mesh. And so here's where I think some of the advantages of this integrated capability start to come in. First off, we can actually see this mesh. In old DAGMC export workflows, we would export this, and then it would result in our H5M file or our mesh file. But then we have no way really to understand what that mesh looks like, or whether it's covering our components well, or just generally is it well formed. Whereas here we can see it up here on screen right away, which is good. And again, this mesh is made watertight inherently as a result of coming from this tri-meshing algorithm. Let's see, what's the next thing to talk about? Right. So one thing that we used to do within DAGMC is specify what's called a faceting tolerance. And now we have these different kind of settings for the deviation angle and the anisotropic ratio. So these are different mesh parameters than we've used in the past. However, the faceting tolerance, or the distance, the maximum distance from a point on the triangle to the CAD surface that it's trying to represent, is a very apt measure for the error that you would expect to see in the Neutronics tally measurements that you're taking, because it's going to describe how much that track length for your tally estimator is going to vary based on this discretization of that CAD surface. Thankfully, one of the Coreform folks, Greg Vernon, provided us a nice little script that allows us to compute that faceting tolerance after the fact. And so that's the third script that we're going to run today. It's just this script that goes through all the different triangles that are available, and it will report out to us the maximum triangle to surface distance on this model. And so I used a deviation angle of 1, and we got something like, down here we see in the console, a distance of 0.03 geometry units, and in Neutronics units, that's going to be 0.03 centimeters. But if I used something instead, like potentially a deviation angle of 0.5, and I remesh this model, overriding all my previous mesh, I can visually see that the triangles are now more dense on this outer volume. And then if I rerun that, computing the faceting tolerance, we'll see that it now reduces from 0.03 to 0.008 centimeters. And so then at that point, it's kind of left up to you, the user, to understand how finely this mesh needs to be generated to represent the model accurately, as accurately as you need it to. So I'm actually going to change this deviation back to an angle of 1 and apply the scheme, and then mesh that model. So we'll go back to our relatively coarse meshing of this. And then I just want to talk about some other advantages of this, of using the integrated meshing capabilities within Cubit here. In this case, with respect to the boundary of this problem. So we see that there's a lot of triangles dedicated to representing the boundary of this problem, but really what it's doing for us is just telling us where the particles need to be terminated. And it just so happens that, you know, this is an air volume, and particles that reach this space or reach this volume, I guess, this air outside of the reactor, are fairly unlikely to re-enter the reactor and contribute to our results in a meaningful way, especially for criticality. And so really, we don't need this exterior volume to be represented as with as high of fidelity as some of the interior spaces within this core. So what we can do is go in and select these 3 surfaces. Instead of using a deviation angle of something like 1, we can then crank that up to, say, 10, and apply the scheme and mesh this. And we get a much more coarse mesh, but it's going to reduce our memory footprint, and it's going to increase the ray tracing, or sorry, decrease the ray tracing time that's required to find surface intersections here, with really no change in the outcome of our analysis. And this is something that would have been very difficult or pretty much impossible to do with the previous faceting engine for graphics kind of approach to generating DAGMC models. So this is a lot of kind of exciting, like, new things that we'll be able to tackle and kind of explore within this environment. Okay, with that, we now have meshed our model and we can finally go ahead and export this. And I'll just demonstrate that. So if we go to the File menu and then click on Export, we'll see that just like the dropdown for the MCMP import, this now is available as part of the export capability within Cubit also. So I'm just going to navigate to the folder where all of my other assembly input files are, as well as some OpenMC files that we'll use to run this. And we'll just call this model the ZPPR, Zero Power Physics Reactor.h5m. We'll go ahead and save that. Again, this is another place where we might be able to add some different options for the DAGMC export in the future. And click Finish. And that model has now been exported. So at this point, we can spend a little bit of time prepping for a simulation using this model with OpenMC. This is the location where I just exported it. So you'll see that file appear here at the end of my listing. And within this folder, I also have a materials.xml that contains the translated materials to OpenMC from this benchmark input, as well as a settings file also. And so those two files in combination with a geometry XML file, we can use to run an OpenMC simulation of this reactor. I do have a CSG version of that here as well, but we'll be using the CAD version. And then I'm just going to walk through a little bit on how to generate that geometry XML with OpenMC. So model generation with OpenMC occurs through Python. And if I import this model, or import, sorry, OpenMC itself, I have the ability to generate within OpenMC what's called a DAGMC universe. So if I call this just DAGU, see, I was practicing this morning. So I can do a DAGMC universe. And all I need to specify, all that's required for me to specify is the DAGMC file that I would like to use to populate that universe. So if you're familiar with CSG, you can use universes to fill other regions. So essentially I could do something like define a box or a cylinder and then say, I would like this collection of geometry to fill that space. And that's how DAGMC geometry operates within OpenMC. What that gives us the ability to do in OpenMC is represent combined or hybrid CSG and DAGMC models. So you could have, for example, an interior core region where you have a lot of repeated geometry that's relatively simple. That can all be represented in CSG, and you can create an exterior CSG cell outside of the core, and then fill that with a CAD-based geometry that represents a lot of complex shielding or piping or what have you, or multi-physics regions potentially for TH calculations, if you want to do something like X core calculations, essentially. So that's a form of geometry that we support within OpenMC. And I just wanted to note that like the boundary conditions here that we've applied within this model are going to be respected in the same way that CSG boundary conditions are used within OpenMC. So the fact that we've set vacuum boundary conditions within this model, if particles reach those before reaching an exterior CSG surface, for example, that has its own set of boundary conditions, then the ones that the particles see first are going to be used and respected. So I just wanted to kind of note that. Really, the idea is that we try to integrate DAGMC within OpenMC in a way that it operates in the same way as any other kind of geometry that you'd be using with OpenMC, namely CSG. Okay, so with that mini rant over, I'm going to go ahead and create this universe, and then that universe can be used to form an OpenMC geometry object, and where I specify that the root universe or the uppermost universe is just this DAGMC universe. So as long as boundary conditions are applied correctly, this geometry, the DAGMC geometry, can represent the entirety of the OpenMC geometry. There's no need to specify a CSG cell and then insert the DAGMC geometry, although we can do that if we wanted to. So with this geometry, I'll then go ahead and export it to the XML file that we're going to require. If I look at files that I've just generated, we'll see as of this morning, just now, I've created my geometry.xml. So I'll go ahead and exit the Python interpreter. We could certainly run OpenMC from in here, but I'll do that and then clear my console. And at this point, I can go ahead and run OpenMC. I'll specify that we're going to run it with a certain number of threads here, so we get a decent particle rate, and we'll see this come up. So we can see OpenMC's header, as you may be familiar with. We've used that code before. And then notably, we can tell that the DAGMC model is being used based on a couple of messages that we see here. So one is loading this file. It's a good indicator. It's loading the file that we expect it to. And it's initializing some geometry tools within DAGMC. It has this message that's, again, related to a faceting tolerance that no longer is present for this particular export version. But that doesn't mean the model is invalid by any means. And then it's just noting here this graveyard volume, again, that's kind of a bespoke version of a boundary condition within DAGMC that we decided not to include today. And then it will go through all the different operations of loading the cross-section data that's relevant for our simulation. And we see it starting to perform our k-eigenvalue simulation functionality with 20 batches of inactive transport, essentially meaning that we're trying to converge a fission source here. And then I don't recall, actually, did I run 80? Yeah. And then 80 active batches to converge that eigenvalue down to around 100 PCM. And so at the end of the simulation here, we see our final combined k-effective value. And so this was all running on the CAD-based geometry that we're using Coreform. And here we see the final result, which from the benchmark was within, I think, 100 PCM of the benchmark value that was provided using this CAD-based geometry. So even with that discretization, it's very, very close. And I should note that it's not using the same set of cross-section data that was available at the time that benchmark was produced. I think it was, for those familiar, it was using NDEF 5 and 6, and then like some other particular set of information for the beryllium oxide reflectors. So that is just to say that this isn't meant to be a declaration that, you know, this is the exact value or anything, but it certainly is in the right space. Let's see. So going back to our model, I just wanted to note one other small advantage before I wrap up and answer any questions that we might have on the webinar. Another advantage of this is the ability to volume mesh components. And so in particular for multiphysics, if I turn off my outer volume, and let's say I want to look at some interior volume of my core. One thing that's really nice to be able to do for a multiphysics simulation is to do a TET mesh. In fact, most commonly, you're doing a TET mesh for a multiphysics simulation. But one added perk of this integrated export capability is that were I to TET mesh one of these interior volumes and then export it, export the entire model as a DAGMC model, it will use the boundary triangles of that TET mesh of the component to represent the DAGMC surface. And so then you have this conformal representation, knowing that particles are crossing the exact same set of triangles that you would be using for a TET mesh in a multiphysics simulation. That's really worth noting. I think it's something that I am planning on using in the near future. And so I just wanted to note that for any of you interested in multiphysics workflows as well. So I don't have time to like go through that in more detail, unfortunately, right now. We'll just move on to kind of a few notes on this MCMP import capability and then wrap up with some reference links at the end. But a couple of notes that I just wanted to provide about the MCMP import capability and what it's doing internally. The CSG that we looked at in this text-based format consists of these Boolean combinations of what we refer to as half spaces of analytic surfaces. So the interior of an infinite cylinder, or interior of a sphere, exterior, or of an ellipsoid, et cetera, et cetera. And so these region expressions, as parts become really complicated, can become expensive to evaluate, especially in a CAD space, as when this importer tool goes through, we have to import each of these different surfaces that make up the volume and then perform the Boolean operations to generate the resulting final volume at the end. And so there's a lot of, like, you'll notice if you try this, you'll get very high volume IDs because we're going through a lot of those essentially to generate the final volume and then discarding kind of whatever else is left over at the end. Internally, every one of these operations requires an update of user-facing information in the GUI. For example, the model tree, if we've added a group or a new volume, and the rendering as well, will need to be updated potentially. And so this can really become onerous when we have geometries with repeated features like fission core structures, things with lattices, for example. And so some suggested optimizations to try if you feel like you've been importing a model and it's just taking way too long, or you're confused about why the IDs are getting so high. A couple of things to try would be to apply these following settings in the console if you're doing this within the GUI. So this will just turn off a lot of superfluous information and temporarily turn off the graphics so that a lot of the user-facing information doesn't need to be updated, and hopefully make that import go faster. Additionally, you can also import models through the Python module, which would circumvent the GUI altogether. And so what you might be able to do is just import this and then save it immediately to the Cubit's native format so that you can open it in the GUI. So just a couple of suggestions on that if you're trying to import like really intricate models. And then to wrap up, and before I take questions here, I just want to provide a bunch of these references for the different scripts that we run. Again, those will be provided on the forum later. And then also some links for things like Python modules for DAGMC. There is an MCMP adapter tool for OpenMC, so you can translate this entire or an entire MCMP input deck into the materials and geometry for an OpenMC run with a native OpenMC geometry if you so choose. But of course, that won't result in a CAD model for you if that's your interest. And then there's also examples of how to use this mixed CSG and DAGMC geometry within OpenMC available online as well that I wanted to include if that's of interest. Okay, and with that, I will go ahead and take any questions
Great.
that we have time for.
Yes, Patrick, thank you so much. We do have a few questions. So one from Nicholas: to get the DAGMC mesh into OpenMC, you need to fill a cell with the DAGMC universe and define a containing region. Is there any benefit to defining boundary conditions directly into Cubit versus defining them on the surfaces of the containing region?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, if you wanted to use a hybrid geometry approach, you would do, as you said, Nicholas, fill an OpenMC cell with the DAGMC universe and then set your boundary conditions on surfaces of that cell. As far as benefits to doing that, to setting the boundary conditions on the CSG cell versus the CAD surfaces, I think it's kind of one or the other. Either one is totally fine. I think that in my head, it's just a little bit simpler if you can provide, or if you can do it in the Cubit model, it's a little more convenient and everything's kind of contained within a single file. One benefit would be that if you're planning on running this, not just with OpenMC, but also if you wanted to run this with some of the other codes that DAGMC supports, like MCMP or Shift or GM4, then you would want those boundary conditions to apply to all of the codes and therefore be as in the Cubit model itself and the resulting H5M. So I think that is where it would really be of benefit.
Great, thanks. Question from Felipe: I thought models produced by Cubit were not guaranteed to be watertight in the past. Has it changed because of the new meshing tools you mentioned?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to like go into more detail on that, but I will try to touch on that again here. So in the past, we used triangles that were generated from the faceting engine for graphics within Cubit, which is different from the meshing engine itself within Cubit. So the faceting engine was really just based on what was giving you this visualization of the model, which isn't like meant to be something that's actually representative of the underlying representation or the analytic representation. And so then what we would do afterwards is stitch those things together, especially along like the seams where two surfaces were meeting at the edge of a volume to guarantee water tightness. But now that we're using the internal meshing algorithms of Cubit itself and the mesh elements, those elements are, as they're generated, as you see them on screen, are watertight. So we don't need to worry about a sealing approach if we're using this integrated DAGMC export approach.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, from Ryan, can you briefly discuss how to specify the mesh that's produced for defining mesh tallies and discuss the benefits relative to a more typical mesh tally, like specific to the volume?
Okay, looks like there's an additional explanation. So I'll read that out. As an example to make a DAGMC. Oh, okay, it's separate. So, okay. Suppose how to specify the mesh that's produced for defining mesh tallies. So there's a number of different ways to handle mesh tallies. It again varies from code to code a little bit. And I can speak to OpenMC in that you can define unstructured mesh tallies, but generally the way that Neutronics codes employ mesh tallies is that they are sort of superimposed on top of the geometry, the meshes are. And so if you have something like a regular mesh, it's going to be sort of independent from the DAGMC geometry. And that is true of, in OpenMC, that's true of unstructured mesh as well. So we could generate a TET mesh from this model that we were just looking at in Coreform and export it and then apply that as a unstructured mesh within OpenMC. But we could also do that if the underlying geometry were CSG. So that it's kind of independent from the geometry representation to a large degree. And then I'll try to give my interpretation of the second piece of this question, discussing the benefits relative to a more typical mesh tally or one that's specific to the volume. I guess I don't quite understand the full question there. Something that's specific to a volume. I guess like you could have a mesh that's specific to a volume. You could certainly generate a TET mesh for one volume and the entire CAD model and export that and apply it within OpenMC. But yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure what the full question was digging at. So I hope I covered your questions, but I'd be happy to answer them later on in the Coreform discussion forum.
Okay. Great. And then maybe this was already covered, Patrick, but how to get the tally from the DAGMC mesh?
Yeah, so again, similar to my response about the tallies, there is some, for certain codes, there's some native, or there's some ways to tag tally information within the DAGMC model. I think, especially for OpenMC and for, I think most codes, it's really better to try to specify those tallies as part of the native input pieces. So in OpenMC, what I can do is, specify a cell filter, which would be analogous to like filtering out a specific volume that I want information about within the DAGMC model and apply it that way. I think that would be my recommended approach at this point in time. There is like support for that within the DAGMC spec, but it's not super well developed at this point. And so my recommendation would be to approach a tally that way, essentially using the native capabilities of whatever Monte Carlo code that you're trying to use.
Yeah. Great. Okay, looks like Brian has a little bit more specific clarification on that other question. Patrick, if you want to respond to that, and then this.
Oh yeah, I see. Okay, I think I understand, Ryan. So yeah, what Ryan was trying to get at is that mesh tally, using like an unstructured mesh tally or a tally with DAGMC is much better for complex components, because for something like a regular mesh, it's not guaranteed that your elements are going to, your mesh elements or the tally mesh elements are going to be conformal to the geometry necessarily. So the ability to use something like an unstructured mesh or even do this representation in a CAD-based geometry itself is advantageous.
Great. Okay. So there's additional questions then, oh, I guess here's one last one from Ibrahim. Are we able to use a second order hex mesh in volumetric meshing for DAGMC?
Yeah, we are not yet. Second order elements can be really tricky. They add a level of complexity to the particle transport, in particular the ray tracing. Certainly not impossible. It's just not something that we've explored currently with DAGMC, but it's definitely of interest. And we actually have a couple research proposals out to try to enable that within DAGMC and OpenMC.
Great. Okay, thanks again, everyone, for attending. If you have additional questions, feel free to post those in the Coreform forum, and we'll answer them. And hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks all.